Very briefly, let me summarize what will be discussed in this video. This video is part 2 of a video I did a year ago called Stars Dimming at Jet Plane Altitudes Equals Absolute Death to Heliocentrism. Well, I'll get into that in a moment, but briefly in one sentence, what that video covered is the concept that stars increase in brightness as you go from sea level up into something like Rocky Mountain National Park, and the stars dramatically increase in their brightness. But if you're in a jetliner flying over Rocky Mountain National Park, the stars are dimmer than both the sea level area without light pollution interfering and Rocky Mountain National Park. And the conclusion of that is absolute death to heliocentrism. It's utterly impossible, as described in that aforementioned video from a year ago, that can happen if heliocentrism is true. So that thesis I call the heliocentrism death blow, or HD in brief. Recently, I've come across an attempt from the round earth, anti-flat earth community to explain how stars can do that, to try to overcome the heliocentrism death blow. And that involves the concept of saying that starlight is invisible from space, and you start to see that when you're at jetliner altitudes. So starlight starts to fade out. That is in disagreement with what astronomers, astronauts, space agencies claim. Of course, I'm a flat earther, so I don't even believe what they say. But the point is that the objection I will deal with to the heliocentrism death blow in this article is an objection for the round earth community that does not agree with mainstream science. Mainstream science says that astronauts and space station residents and so forth can readily see through their window panes and masks of their space helmets and so forth starlight readily. It's not invisible, it's perceivable. But I will forego that and assume starlight is invisible in space in order to deal with this objection from round earthers, in order to show that that objection is absurdist, to get to the conclusion raised in my previous video from a year ago that stars dimming at jet plane altitudes equals absolute death for heliocentrism. So let's proceed. Approximately 1 year ago, I presented a video which discussed the empirically verifiable fact, verifiable to every single person on Earth, that when one is on somewhere near sea level, say 1,000 feet, 0 to 1,000 feet to sea level, stars appear with one sort of brightness, and then when one travels up to, say, somewhere like Rocky Mountain National Park and is over a mile above sea level, stars brighten tremendously. And then further, when one ascends higher, such as on a jet plane traveling over Rocky Mountain National Park, stars become dimmer. Amazingly. This is a tremendous problem for the heliocentric model of the solar system, which, as I stated in the video from February 27, 2017, titled Stars Dimming at Jet Plane Altitudes Equals Absolute Death to Heliocentrism, needs to be addressed by every astronomer on Earth. How can this be? Now, the point of this video is to address an objection to this point by the round Earth heliocentric position. In other words, there is an attempt to explain how the issue of how stars become brighter from near sea level to somewhere like Rocky Mountain National Park and then dim again is not addressed in this objection, but the attempt to address why stars become dimmer at jet plane altitudes is addressed in this objection. Okay, so I will first play this objection by the anti-Zetetic, anti-flat earth community, by someone in that community, and then I will show that this objection fails, and therefore the original claim of stars dimming at jet plane altitudes equals the absolute death to heliocentrism stands. Here is that objection. Please listen as follows.
Because you can't see stars in space without specialized lenses.
Yeah, I remember you saying that.
Right, and so it brought up, and see, here's the thing: if you're going to fake it, the reason would be for, or why bring up the issue of no stars being seen and engender that whole discussion, because there was a lot of that going on. Everybody thought it was fake because you couldn't see the stars. But in my way of thinking, that was proof that they, if they were faking it, they were at least aware of the conditions in space.
Right, because the photons in light needs to interact with something, right? So in space, there's a vacuum essentially,
right?
Almost, right?
The further you go in the atmosphere, in airplanes at night, the fewer stars you are able to see.
Mm-hmm.
They start dropping off at levels of photonic intensity. So the dimmer ones disappear as you rise up through the atmosphere.
Right.
And so you need a certain level of air over you to act as a refraction point to be able to at least get close enough to see the stars.
Firstly, and very briefly, this objection said specialized lenses are needed to view stars in space. Please disregard that comment. That is not part of the content of this video, and that comment is contradicted by the 4 articles that you're seeing on your screen right now, which say that astronauts from the space station and other places in space can freely see stars and do stargazing. And these articles say that there was exposure issues for why stars were not seen in the Apollo moon landing. So, but please disregard that issue, and let's continue on with the more prescient matter at hand, which is how from sea level to Rocky Mountain National Park, stars increase in brightness, and then on planes going over Rocky Mountain National Park, stars greatly decrease in their brightness. That's the matter being discussed, and which is claimed to be a fatal contradiction to the heliocentric model. So let's proceed. Also, please note that this is a theoretical objection, not an empirical objection. That will be a main point that we'll discuss very shortly. So the philosophical argument just presented contains the following thesis. The less dense a patch or volume of Earth's atmosphere is, the less interaction photons of light have with air, since there's less air in the specific volume in question. And since the argument you just heard involved the assumption that only reflected light is visible in a vacuum, not emitted light or unreflected light, then therefore the less density of air, the less photonic interaction with air that exists, the less of observable reality will be seen by way of particles of light entering one's eyes. In simpler terms, this philosophical argument you just heard holds the conclusion that emitted light is not visible. It's visible to the human eye or cameras. That's a very important point we'll get to later. Eyes or cameras in a vacuum. Only reflected light is. Now, there is no experiment that I could find verifying that anywhere, and I searched all over the place. In simpler words, I could not find an experiment of light in a vacuum where the light source is literally in the vacuum, and it can't be a light bulb, because a light bulb will the photons will interact with the glass edge of the light bulb. And it can't be fire, because fire does not light in a vacuum, it needs air. It would have to be a plasma only. That's the only, or something like that. But it's the only type of emitting light source I would know of. So I did not see an experiment where there's a camera inside of a vacuum filming emitted light, where the emitted light is not picked up, it is invisible to the camera, but only the reflected light off the walls of the vacuum chamber, which is light emitted from the plasma, but reflected off the inner apparatuses and boundaries, the inside of the vacuum chamber, are picked up by the camera. To my knowledge, that experiment has not been done. Or if it has been done, I could not find it on YouTube, I could not find it in web searches and so forth. Would seem that somebody somewhere would have done it, because if in fact the camera inside the chamber only picks up the reflected light off the chamber itself, not the emitted light of the plasma, that would essentially prove that stars in space are not viewable, as this objection just involved, but which the articles you just saw on your screen contradicted. So that right there alone, or at least throw into great question and a tailspin the objection you just heard for why stars dim on airliners, which would be a fatal contradiction to the heliocentric model. But the point of this article is to nevertheless address this issue contained in the objection and show that the idea that stars are not visible in a vacuum, and that's why they start to dim in the jetliner, does not make sense, is incorrect. They should become brighter and brighter, according to the heliocentric model, as one ascends higher and higher into the sky. They don't, so therefore this is a death blow to the heliocentric model. But let's continue with the objection. So for the moment, let's assume that the objection you just heard from someone in the anti-zetetic community said, where special lenses are needed to see stars in space because emitted and unreflected. Let's assume it's the case at the moment in order to address this objection, because there'll be nothing that the heliocentric proponents can do about that situation. It is the number one death blow to heliocentrism. So in order to verify that emitted, unreflected, and unrefracted light is invisible in a vacuum, an experiment would need to be set up. Okay, because if you say, oh, we can verify it in space, even though space agencies and astronauts reject that's the case, even if you wanted to say that, that's not a scientific experiment, because for it to be a scientific experiment, everybody needs to be able to verify it with their own eyes, or else it's not science, it's philosophy. So to verify it for any pair of eyes on Earth, and to make it a scientific situation, an experiment would need to be set up to mimic the situation of emitted, unreflected, unrefracted light in a vacuum, where only one is visible and the emitted light is not. Okay, so the experiment would look as follows, as you see on your screen right now, where you have a vacuum chamber with a camera. Now there's a problem with this experiment, which this experiment doesn't work. It's impossible. I'll explain why in a minute. It has to do with the camera, if you haven't already thought of it. But briefly put, the way the experiment would have to be set up is this would be in a completely dark room, so no light could get into the chamber and illuminate the chamber. The only light source can be the plasma, which contains emitted, unreflected, unrefracted light. In the vacuum chamber, the camera would be set up to record the plasma activity. Otherwise, there's perfect darkness. What should happen if this experiment was done, what should happen, as stated, is only reflected light off the apparatuses in the chamber, and the chamber borders itself will be detectable. The plasma itself will be invisible. Okay, so this experiment, to my knowledge, has never been done, so we can't explore this, and we can't show it on the screen what the results are, so we have to discuss this philosophically. And what we know is, as already mentioned, this experiment cannot be done, because, as alluded to, the camera itself has a glass lens. Light from the plasma entering the camera will interact with the glass and will interact with the internal components of the camera, and therefore will be reflected and refracted light processed by the innards of the camera. So the overall point here is that there is no such thing as detecting and measuring light that is only emitted, not reflected and refracted, light that has not interacted with anything other than space, whatever space is, space-time, after being emitted from the subatomic level. Because light to be detected will interact with cameras, will interact with eyes, retinas, and therefore will be more than just emitted light at that point. It will be light that has interacted with particles. So, in summary, if someone is to claim, as you heard someone in the anti-flat earth community state, that light of stars in space is invisible to the eye, even though professional astronomers, space agencies, and astronauts disagree with that. Someone were to claim that and say that special lenses and so forth were needed, that would be an impossible philosophical argument, because such light is never unreflected. Light to be detected by cameras, by eyes, by astronauts in space, by being detected, interacts with cameras and eyes. And therefore, all light in space will be visible. To say that light is invisible in space is incorrect. If you hypothetically could exist in the vacuum of space and photons from a star touched your retina, at that point right there, the light has interacted and will be detectable and will produce a vision experience in your visual field, in your consciousness. You will see the light, in other words. So, even if it were the case that the light was actually invisible, astronauts in space, by the time it gets to them, will see it through their windows in the space stations. Just they'll see it through their helmets, the masks in their helmets, and so forth. So all starlight is visible. And the argument you heard for saying why starlight in space is invisible, which is supposedly connected to the idea that stars dim from a jetliner, is ipso facto contradicted and false and should be rejected. And if somebody is to do the experiment we mentioned of the plasma with the camera in the vacuum chamber, the plasma will be visible because the camera will interact with the photons emitted from the plasma. And that will prove that stars should be observable in space. As far as why they weren't for the moon landing, that's not an issue that I'm going to address in this video. It's been addressed by others previously. My specific issue only is to discuss the fatal contradiction to heliocentrism due to starlight increasing when one goes from sea level to mountains and decreasing from when one is higher than that in planes. Should not happen, as I discussed in my first video a year ago, and the heliocentric model is fatally contradicted.